For decades, the wealthy nations of the Persian Gulf placed an enormous bet on their own future. They understood, with clear and unsentimental eyes, that the oil which had made them fabulously rich would not flow forever, and that a nation built on a single depleting resource was a nation living on borrowed time. So, they made a decision as bold as any in modern economic history. They would transform their scorching desert lands into glittering global destinations, and they would draw the entire world to their doorstep. They poured hundreds of billions of dollars into this vision. Dubai raised forests of impossible skyscrapers, built islands in the shape of palm trees, and opened shopping malls the size of small cities. Qatar staged a football World Cup that captivated the planet. Saudi Arabia flung open its long-closed doors and announced staggering mega-projects, entire futuristic cities rising from the sand. They built world-beating airlines, cavernous airports, and endless ranks of luxury hotels and resorts, all designed to lure the traveler and the tourist. And for years, the great bet paid off spectacularly, as visitors arrived in ever-swelling numbers. But then, in the year 2026, something unexpected and unsettling happened. The tourists began to stay away. Arrivals fell sharply, hotel rooms sat empty, and a region that had confidently forecast booming growth found itself instead watching the visitors simply vanish. So what on earth happened? Has the great Gulf tourism gamble finally begun to fail? The answer, as we shall see, is considerably more complicated and a great deal more revealing than any simple story of collapse. To understand the shock of what unfolded in 2026, you first have to grasp just how completely these nations committed themselves to tourism, how thoroughly they built everything around the promise of the visitor. This was never a casual side venture. It was a fundamental reimagining of what these countries would be. Take Dubai, the undisputed pioneer of the strategy. Half a century ago, it was a modest trading port on the edge of the desert. Today, it is one of the most visited cities on the planet, a place that conjured a world-class tourism industry essentially out of nothing. Through sheer will and staggering investment, its airline, Emirates, became a global giant, and its airport became one of the busiest international hubs anywhere on Earth, a place through which a substantial fraction of all long-haul travel between Europe, Asia, and Africa passes. The entire model was built on a simple and powerful idea: position yourself as the crossroads of the world, the place everyone flies through and, ideally, stops to enjoy. Qatar followed a similar path, leveraging its own powerful airline and the global spectacle of the World Cup to put Doha firmly on the map. And most dramatically of all, Saudi Arabia, long almost entirely closed to leisure tourism, launched an audacious plan to become a major destination. Investing sums so vast they are difficult to comprehend in brand new resort regions and entire cities conceived from scratch. Across the Gulf, tourism was elevated from an afterthought into a central pillar of the national economy and the national identity itself. It is worth pausing to appreciate just how deliberate and how total this transformation was, because it was not simply a matter of building a few hotels and hoping for the best. These were comprehensive, state-directed campaigns to manufacture a tourism industry from the ground up, touching every element of the visitor experience. The Gulf states built the airlines and then built the airports to house them, turning their national carriers into instruments of national strategy, designed to funnel the world's travelers through their cities. They built the attractions to give those travelers a reason to stop: the record-breaking towers, the artificial archipelagos, the indoor ski slopes and desert safaris and vast entertainment complexes. They built the hotels to house the visitors, tens of thousands of luxury rooms rising along the coastlines. They courted the great global events, the sporting tournaments and business summits and cultural festivals, understanding that a single marquee event could put a city on the mental map of millions. And they marketed themselves relentlessly across the globe, crafting images of sun-soaked luxury and futuristic wonder beamed into homes on every continent. This was economic transformation, pursued with the focus and resources of a national mobilization, and its ambition was breathtaking. The goal was nothing less than to make these desert nations indispensable to global travel. And for a remarkable stretch of time, they succeeded. And for a long stretch of years, this monumental gamble looked like an unqualified triumph. The visitors poured in by the tens of millions. Dubai alone welcomed nearly 20 million international visitors in a single recent year, a record figure, with its hotels running at extraordinarily high rates of occupancy. Saudi Arabia's tourism spending soared to record levels as its new strategy gathered momentum. The entire region had positioned itself as one of the world's premier travel corridors, and the forecasts for the future were dazzling. Indeed, heading into 2026, the industry confidently projected that tourism across the region would grow by another healthy margin, perhaps 13%, continuing the seemingly unstoppable upward march. The great bet appeared not merely to have paid off, but to be paying off more richly with each passing year. The desert had been turned into a magnet for the world, and the world, it seemed, could not get enough. What made this success especially remarkable was that it was achieved in the teeth of formidable natural disadvantages. These were not naturally blessed tourist paradises with gentle climates and ancient, ready-made attractions. They were harsh deserts with brutal, punishing summers, little natural greenery, and, in several cases, almost no pre-existing tourism tradition to build upon. Everything that drew the visitor had to be conceived, financed, and painstakingly constructed entirely from nothing, often at colossal expense and against the grain of the environment itself. That the Gulf managed, in a few decades, to convert such unpromising raw material into some of the most sought-after destinations on the planet was a genuine triumph of ambition and capital over circumstance. It made the boom feel not just lucrative, but vindicating. A powerful proof that vision and money together could manufacture success almost anywhere on Earth, however unpromising the ground. And then the tourists stopped coming. The reversal, when it arrived in 2026, was abrupt and severe. In the first quarter of the year, international arrivals across the Middle East fell by around 14% compared to the year before, a stunning drop for a region accustomed to relentless growth, and it struck during a period that is traditionally one of the strongest for visitors. The effect on the ground was immediate and painful. Hotel occupancy across the region, which had stood at a healthy 75% or so in January, plummeted to somewhere around 48% by March, an extraordinary collapse in just a few short weeks. Hotel managers described watching their forward bookings fall off what one of them called a cliff, and the projections for the full year turned grim. Industry analysts forecast that arrivals could fall anywhere from 11 to 27% over the course of 2026, a swing of tens of millions of fewer visitors and potentially tens of billions of dollars in lost tourism spending when measured against what had been expected. A region that had been bracing for another year of boom was suddenly staring at one of the sharpest downturns in its modern history. On the surface, this looked exactly like the nightmare scenario. The moment the great gamble came undone, the Gulf had built everything for tourists, and the tourists had stopped coming. But here is where we must slow down and ask the crucial question. The question that separates a shallow reading of events from a truthful one. Why did they stop coming? Because the answer is not the one the dramatic headline implies. The tourists did not suddenly decide that the Gulf's dazzling attractions had lost their appeal. The resorts did not fail. The malls and beaches and skyscrapers did not become any less impressive. What happened, instead, was a regional military crisis, a serious conflict centered on Iran that erupted and sent shockwaves through the entire Middle East. And that conflict struck directly at the very foundation of the Gulf's tourism model. Airlines, facing the danger of flying near a war zone, rerouted their aircraft around the affected airspace or suspended flights to the region altogether. Governments around the world issued travel advisories, warning their citizens against journeys to a part of the world that suddenly looked perilous. And traveler confidence, that fragile and essential ingredient of all tourism, evaporated almost overnight. The visitors did not reject the Gulf. They were frightened away from it, and quite literally flown around it, by a war they wanted no part of. This points us toward the genuinely revealing lesson buried inside the 2026 downturn, a lesson about a hidden fragility that the good years had concealed. The Gulf's tourism empire was built, to an enormous degree, on long-haul international leisure and corporate travel, and on the region's role as a global transit hub, the world's great layover. And that turned out to be precisely the vulnerability. Those long-haul international visitors and those transit passengers passing through on their way elsewhere were exactly the travelers most sensitive to any hint of regional danger and exactly the first to disappear the moment trouble began. A tourism economy built on being the crossroads of the world is a magnificent thing when the world is at peace and the skies are open. But it is acutely, dangerously exposed the instant that region becomes a place people are afraid to fly through. The Gulf had constructed a spectacular engine for drawing in the planet, but the fuel that engine ran on was global confidence and open airspace. And a regional war could choke off both of those overnight. The very openness and connectivity that were the Gulf's greatest strengths became, in a moment of crisis, its greatest liability. There is a particular irony worth drawing out here, because the Gulf's transit hub model had always been sold, quite rightly, as a source of strength and resilience. Being the place where the world changes planes gave these cities enormous, diversified flows of travelers, immunity from dependence on any single tourist market, and a central role in the architecture of global aviation. When one part of the world slumped, travelers from another part kept the hubs busy. But this strength contained a hidden condition that went unnoticed in the good years. It assumed the region itself would remain a safe and open space to fly through. The entire model rested, silently, on the stability of Gulf airspace and on the world's willingness to route its journeys through the neighborhood. And when a regional conflict called both of those into question at once, the diversified strength inverted into a concentrated weakness. It was no longer a matter of one source market softening. It was the connective tissue of the whole system seizing up simultaneously. A hub, after all, is only valuable if people are willing to pass through it. And a crossroads in a war zone is a crossroads that travelers will go a long way to avoid. The Gulf had made itself central to global travel, but centrality in a volatile region turned out to cut both ways. And yet, having laid out the severity of the shock, honesty now demands that we swing the other way and be equally clear about what this downturn was not. Because the dramatic headline conceals a far more nuanced and, frankly, more hopeful reality. This was a downturn, but it was emphatically not a death. Several powerful facts complicate the simple story of tourists abandoning the Gulf. Consider, first, that the region had been projected to grow strongly in 2026 before the conflict struck. The underlying demand for Gulf tourism was robust and rising. This was a sudden external shock, knocking a healthy sector off course, not the slow motion failure of an unwanted product. Consider, second, and most importantly, what happened to domestic and regional tourism. Because while international arrivals fell, tourism from within the Gulf itself actually surged, rising by around 16%. Residents of the Gulf states, unable or unwilling to travel abroad amid the uncertainty, took holidays closer to home, visiting neighboring countries and their own domestic attractions, so that regional travelers came to account for well over half of all leisure demand. This domestic boom cushioned the blow enormously. The nuances run deeper still. Consider, third, that total tourism revenue across the region held up far better than the raw arrival numbers would suggest, because the sector shifted its focus toward higher value visitors and robust domestic spending, keeping the overall economic contribution of tourism near record highs, even as the headcount of international arrivals dropped. The industry, in effect, began earning more from each visitor, even as it received fewer of them. Consider, fourth, that Dubai in particular proved remarkably resilient, holding on to strong visitor numbers and high hotel occupancy even into the difficult early months of 2026, as those travelers who did still venture to the region gravitated toward its most established, most trusted, and most safety-conscious destination. And consider, fifth and perhaps most tellingly of all, that Egypt, which lies outside the immediate conflict zone, actually saw its tourism grow by around 16% during the very same period. That single fact is enormously clarifying, because it proves beyond doubt that this was not a case of the wider region losing its allure. It was specifically and precisely about proximity to the conflict. Where there was no war, the tourists kept coming. The problem was never the Gulf's attractions, it was the war on the Gulf's doorstep. So, how have the Gulf nations responded to this sudden reversal, and what does their response tell us? Far from panicking or abandoning their grand strategy, they have moved to adapt and recalibrate. They have leaned hard into the domestic and intra-regional tourism that proved so resilient, actively promoting staycations and encouraging their own residents to explore the region. They have doubled down on entertainment tourism, the concerts, the sporting events, the festivals, and immersive attractions that draw regional visitors and keep them spending. They have shifted their emphasis toward high-value luxury travel, seeking to earn more from fewer guests. And crucially, they have continued to push forward with their enormous long-term construction and investment projects, betting, quite reasonably, that the disruption is a passing storm rather than a permanent climate. Their formidable aviation infrastructure and global connectivity mean that the moment international confidence returns and the skies fully reopen, they are superbly positioned to welcome the world back quickly. They are, in short, treating 2026 as a severe storm to be weathered, not as a final verdict on the wisdom of their gamble. This response reveals something important about how these states think and about the difference between a temporary crisis and a fundamental miscalculation. A country that believed its tourism strategy had been proven wrong would be pulling back, canceling projects, and cutting its losses. The Gulf states are doing very nearly the opposite. They are continuing to break ground on new resorts, new attractions, and new cities, pressing forward with plans that stretch years and even decades into the future. This is the behavior of governments that read the downturn as a disruption to the timeline rather than a refutation of the vision. And there is a certain logic to their confidence. The enormous fixed investments they have already made, the airports and airlines and hotels, do not lose their value simply because a single difficult year has intervened. Those assets sit ready to generate returns the moment conditions normalize. In a sense, having sunk so much capital into the tourism bet, they have little choice but to see it through, and every incentive to project unshakable confidence in its eventual success. Whether that confidence proves to be wise foresight or stubborn optimism will depend once again on events largely outside their hands. But it is a telling measure of how deeply these nations have committed themselves that even a shock of this magnitude has not shaken their fundamental resolve to make tourism the cornerstone of their post-oil future. This brings us to the honest and balanced assessment of where the Gulf truly stands. In the short term, the pain is genuine and substantial. Billions of dollars in revenue have been lost. Hotels and airlines and the countless businesses that depend on tourists have been hurt, and a sector that expected to celebrate another record year has instead had to absorb a serious blow. And the structural vulnerability the crisis exposed is real, and it is not going away. For as long as the Gulf ties its fortunes to being a global tourism and transit hub in one of the most geopolitically volatile regions on Earth, it will remain exposed to exactly this kind of sudden, confidence-shattering shock. That is a permanent feature of the model, not a passing flaw. But at the same time, the fundamentals of the Gulf's tourism industry remain genuinely strong. The infrastructure is world-class, the connectivity is unmatched, the investment continues to flow, and the underlying global appetite for what these destinations offer has not diminished in the slightest. And the powerful cushion of domestic tourism has proven that the sector has a resilience its critics underestimated. So the truthful verdict is this: the Gulf is not watching its tourism dream collapse into ruin. It is, rather, discovering the real limits and the hidden risks of a dream built on persuading the entire world to travel to a turbulent corner of it. Whether the events of 2026 prove to be a temporary scare or the beginning of a longer reckoning depends overwhelmingly on the one factor the Gulf cannot itself control: the return of peace and stability to its region. There is a broader lesson in all of this, one that reaches well beyond the Gulf and speaks to the nature of tourism itself as the foundation of an economy. Tourism is, by its very essence, among the most fragile of all industries. It depends on discretionary spending, the money people part with only when they feel comfortable and secure. It depends on confidence, and above all on the perception of safety, and all of these things can evaporate with breathtaking speed in the face of a war, a pandemic, a natural disaster, or a single frightening headline. The Gulf's experience in 2026 is a vivid, real-time case study in that fragility. You can build the most spectacular attractions the world has ever seen, the tallest towers, and the most luxurious resorts, and the most futuristic cities, and none of it will fill a single hotel room if people are simply too afraid to board the plane. In diversifying away from a dependence on oil and into a dependence on tourism, the Gulf states solved one profound vulnerability only to create another. They traded a reliance on the price of a barrel of crude, which they could not control, for a reliance on global confidence and regional stability, which, as 2026 has painfully demonstrated, they cannot fully control either. So, are the Gulf countries that built everything for tourism now watching the tourists stop coming? In 2026, the answer is yes, for the moment, and for a very specific and instructive reason. A regional war accomplished what no amount of gleaming infrastructure could prevent. It frightened the world away, rerouted the aircraft, and emptied the hotel rooms, laying bare the hard truth that a tourism empire built upon being the world's crossroads is only ever as strong as the world's willingness to pass through it. But it is essential to remember that the tourists did not stop coming because the Gulf had ceased to dazzle. They stopped coming because, for a frightening interval, the region ceased to feel safe. The resorts still stand gleaming in the sun, the great airlines still wait on the tarmac, the domestic visitors still throng the malls and the beaches, and the moment that confidence is restored, the international crowds will in all likelihood come flooding back. The Gulf's great tourism gamble has not failed, but the year 2026 has taught its architects a sobering lesson that they may not have fully accounted for in all their dazzling ambition, that when you build your entire future on welcoming the world, you also, in the very same act, hand the world the power to stay away. And in a region as volatile as this one, that is a power that can be triggered at almost any moment by forces lying entirely beyond the reach of even the most visionary plans, the most beautiful buildings, and the deepest pockets on Earth.